The snow had begun before sunset, thick flakes tumbling down over the open plains like pieces of torn sky. The wind came next, sharp, endless, carrying with it the kind of cold that sliced through denim and bone. By the time darkness swallowed the valley, the storm had turned into a white fury. Inside his small cabin, the silent rancher, Eli Ward, stood by the window, one hand resting on the cold glass. His world had been quiet for 3 years, since the fire, since his wife and boy had gone up in that red roar. He hadn't spoken much since then. Didn't need to. The cattle didn't care for words, and the land only answered with silence. He was pouring himself another cup of coffee when the knock came. It wasn't loud, but in a place where sound itself was rare, it struck him like a shot. He froze. Then it came again, urgent, trembling. When he opened the door, the snow rushed in, and with it, a small figure stumbled forward. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her coat was too thin, her hands blue and shaking. She looked up at him, eyes wide with desperation and something else, trust. "Sir," she whispered through chattering teeth, "please, can I slip under your coat? Just for a moment, I can't feel my hands anymore." He stared, unable to speak. Her lips were pale, her breath coming in broken clouds. Without a word, he pulled her inside and shut the door against the blizzard. She collapsed near the fire, shivering so violently it looked painful. He fetched an old blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. Still, she trembled. The storm outside howled, battering against the windows like fists. Eli crouched near the fire, throwing more wood in. "Where were you headed?" His voice came rough, low from disuse. She blinked, eyes glassy. "North, to the mill. They said there might be work there. But the wagon left me when the snow got bad. I tried to walk," her voice cracked. "I didn't think I'd make it." He studied her quietly. Mud caked the hem of her skirt, frost had bitten her hair. A traveler with no one. He understood that too well. "Name?" he asked. "Clara," she said faintly. "Clara Mayfield." He nodded once. "You'll stay until morning." Her eyes widened. "I can't." "You'll stay," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. She sank back against the chair, exhaustion pulling her under. He draped another blanket over her, then sat back in the corner, hat shadowing his face as the firelight flickered between them. For a long time, the only sound was the storm outside, and the slow, ragged breathing of the girl asleep by his hearth. At some point in the night, she woke again. The fire had burned low, painting the room in faint orange. Eli was still in the chair, unmoving, his coat draped over his shoulders. She watched him for a long moment, her lips trembling, not from the cold this time, but from something deeper. She spoke softly, so softly he almost thought he dreamed it. "Sir, can I slip under your coat?" His head lifted slightly. "I'm still so cold," she said. "Please." He hesitated. His coat had been his armor, his silence his wall. For 3 years, he had let no one near enough to share warmth, because warmth meant life, and life meant loss. But her eyes held a fear he remembered too well, the kind that came from being utterly alone in a merciless world. He opened his coat wordlessly. She moved closer, cautious, as if approaching a wild animal. When she slipped beneath the heavy fabric, her small body shuddered against his side. He could feel her heartbeat racing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a faint hum against his chest. He didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to. Minutes turned to hours. The storm raged on, then softened, and all the while she stayed close, her breathing eventually evening out. Eli stared into the dying fire, his throat tight. He hadn't felt another human heartbeat against his own since the night he carried his boy's small body from the burning house. The memory clawed up his chest like smoke, and he closed his eyes, swallowing hard. When morning came, the world was buried under a white silence. The storm had left everything ghostly and still. Clara stirred first, blinking as the light touched her face. She found herself still half under his coat, her cheek resting against his arm. She moved carefully, afraid to wake him, but his eyes were already open, watching the pale sky beyond the window. "You're awake," she murmured. He nodded once. "I'll be on my way," she said, rising unsteadily. "You've been kind enough already." "The road's gone," he said. "You won't find your way in that." "I can't stay. Then you'll die." His words landed heavy. She looked toward the door, then back at him. "And if I stay?" He didn't answer. The day passed slowly. He went about feeding the animals, fixing the broken gate, chopping wood, all while she sat near the window, her eyes following him. When he returned, her hands were folded neatly in her lap. "Why don't you speak much?" she asked quietly. He paused, resting the axe by the door. "Nothing to say. You spoke to me." He looked at her then, really looked. "Because you were freezing." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then maybe I should stay cold." For the first time in years, he almost smiled back. Almost. As the days stretched, the storm didn't let up. She helped him with the chores, her movements uncertain but determined. She laughed once, when one of the calves tried to nibble her dress, and the sound startled him so much he nearly dropped the pail he was carrying. It had been so long since laughter had lived in these walls. But one night, as the fire burned high, she found him staring at a small wooden box on the mantel. Inside were ashes, old and sealed. She saw the way his hands tightened when she asked, "Who were they?" "My wife. My son." The words came flat, final. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be." Storm took them. Fire, storm, it's all the same in the end. He turned away, but she stepped closer. "It's not the same when someone stays behind." He froze. Something raw passed through his eyes, something unguarded and trembling. "I know what it's like," she said. "My father died when I was little. My mother sold everything we had just to keep me fed. When she got sick, I sat by her bed and prayed for her to wake up. But she never did." Her voice cracked. "And the house was so quiet afterward. So quiet I thought I'd go mad if I didn't hear someone breathe beside me again." Her confession hung in the air like fragile glass. Eli said nothing, but his silence softened. That night, she didn't ask to slip under his coat. He offered it before she could. They sat together by the fire, listening to the storm's sighs, the slow beat of two hearts fighting to thaw. Days turned to a week. The storm broke. The sky cleared. The world was still and blue and endless again. She stood by the fence that morning, her bag packed. "I can't stay here forever," she said. "I know." She hesitated. "You could come with me." He looked at her, the girl who had arrived half dead and trembling, who had filled the empty silence of his home with the sound of life again. For the first time in 3 years, he felt the ache of wanting something, someone. But the land was his graveyard. The ghosts here were not done with him yet. "I belong here," he said quietly. Her eyes shimmered. "And I belonged nowhere, until you gave me a place to breathe." The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of thawing earth. She took one step closer, then another, until she stood before him, looking up into those weathered eyes. "Sir," she whispered again, her voice trembling the same way it had that first night, "can I slip under your coat?" "Just one more time." He lifted the heavy fabric, his breath shallow. She stepped into the warmth, pressing her head against his chest. He held her, not out of pity this time, but out of something he couldn't name. Outside, the snow began to melt. Inside, the silence broke. The coat hung loosely around them, its folds heavy with the scent of smoke and pine. For a moment, there was nothing else, no ghosts, no wind, no sound but the fragile rhythm of their hearts. The firelight swayed across their faces, catching the faint tremor of her eyelashes and the stillness in his gaze. Eli didn't move, he only breathed, slow and uneven, as though afraid the smallest motion would shatter what was left of the night. She looked up at him, her cheek pressed against the coarse wool. "I didn't mean to make it hard for you," she whispered. He blinked. "You didn't. But you look like someone who's learned to live with walls." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh, or a sigh. "Walls keep things standing. Sometimes they keep things out," she murmured, her voice almost lost in the fabric between them. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because he knew she was right, and he'd spent years convincing himself otherwise. Outside, the snow cracked softly under its own weight. The first light of dawn was beginning to seep through the small frosted window. Clara drew back slightly, studying his face, the lines that spoke of sleepless nights and quiet endurance, the steady eyes that seemed always to hold back more than they showed. "I'll make breakfast," she said finally, stepping away, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. Eli watched her cross the room, the hem of her dress brushing against the floorboards. It had been years since another person's movements had filled this cabin with life. He hadn't realized how empty it had been until now. The morning passed in slow, quiet rhythm. She cooked what little they had, cornbread, coffee, a few eggs from the co-op, and he worked in silence beside her, fixing the loose latch on the barn door, shoveling the paths half buried by the storm. They didn't talk much, but their silences began to feel less like walls and more like bridges, thin, uncertain, but real. When he came in for lunch, she was standing by the window, staring out over the field of white. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Dangerous," he replied. "Most beautiful things are." He poured coffee into 2 mugs, sliding one across the table toward her. She took it, her fingers brushing his for an instant. It was a small touch, but it struck through him like the first warm wind after winter. That night, the stars returned, millions of them spread over the dark sky like dusted salt. The storm had passed, and the world had gone still. Eli stood by the fence, coat pulled tight, his breath curling in the cold. He heard the door creak open behind him, the soft crunch of her boots in the snow. "You never sleep early," she said. "Too quiet," he replied. "I thought you liked quiet." He turned, meeting her gaze under the starlight. "Used to." She stood beside him, her arms folded. The silence stretched again, not heavy this time, but fragile. "When I was little," she said, "my mother used to tell me that stars were holes in the sky where souls look through. I used to imagine my father watching me from one of them." He looked up at the stars, and something inside him loosened. Maybe she was right. She smiled faintly. "Then your boy's up there too." He said nothing for a long time. His jaw tightened, his breath hitched. Then, finally, his voice came low and raw. He was 4. Used to run out to the barn barefoot, said the mud felt like cake under his toes. His throat tightened again. Fire started from the kitchen stove. By the time I reached them, he couldn't finish. Clara reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. Her fingers were smaller, softer, and yet the touch steadied him in a way nothing else had in years. "You don't have to keep holding on to the pain alone," she whispered. "I don't know how not to." "Then let someone hold it with you." He looked down at her, the reflection of starlight caught in her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had offered to share his sorrow, and even longer since he'd let himself believe he deserved it. The next day dawned bright and sharp. The snow began to melt, thin streams running down the slopes, trickling into the earth. Life was returning to the land, and to him. She stayed another week, then another. Each morning, he'd find her humming while sweeping the porch, or helping mend the broken fence. She laughed easily now, though sometimes he saw shadows move behind her smile. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, a quiet understanding grew between them, one that words could ruin. One evening, she came back from the barn with hay tangled in her hair and dirt on her skirt. "You never told me ranch work could be this stubborn," she teased. "You didn't ask." She laughed, and the sound filled the space between them like light. He found himself watching her more often, the curve of her smile, the way she tucked stray strands of hair behind her ear. Something in him began to ache again, but it wasn't the old kind of ache. It was something gentler, alive. That night, as she stirred the stew, she said quietly, "When the road's clear, I'll have to go." He didn't respond. He only stared at the slow swirl of smoke from the fire. "I can't stay hidden forever," she went on. "There's a world waiting. Maybe work. Maybe something more." He nodded once, though his chest tightened at the words. "Unless," she paused, looking up. "Unless you'd want me to stay." He looked at her, and for a long moment, his silence was heavier than any storm. Then he rose and walked to the window, resting one hand against the glass. "Everyone I ever cared for left me somehow, Clara. The land took them, or life did. I don't know if I could watch it happen again." She crossed the room slowly, stopping just behind him. "Then don't watch it happen. Keep it from happening." He turned toward her, and in that moment, something in his restraint broke. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek, rough fingers trembling against her skin. Her eyes fluttered shut. "I don't know how to start again," he whispered. "You already have." She leaned into his touch, and for the first time in years, Eli let himself feel everything he had buried. Loss, hope, fear, desire, all tangled together like roots breaking through frozen ground. That night, they sat close by the fire again, no words needed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and his arms settled around her as naturally as breath. Outside, the wind murmured across the plains, soft and forgiving. Days became weeks. Spring crept slowly over the land. The cattle began to graze again, the rivers filled with thawed water, and wildflowers pushed up through the mud. Clara stayed. Neither of them said it out loud, there was no need. Her few belongings remained by the bed, her laughter by the fire, her warmth stitched into every small corner of his days. One morning, he woke before dawn and found her outside, sitting on the fence, watching the sunrise. Her hair glowed gold in the light, and her breath made small clouds in the air. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Didn't want to," she said softly. "It's too beautiful to miss." He joined her on the fence, and for a while they simply watched the sun climb over the hills, painting the ranch in shades of gold and pink. "Eli," she said after a moment, "do you ever think people can be given a second life without dying first?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when everything you were is gone, and somehow you start again anyway. Like the land after a storm." He nodded slowly. "If that's true, then maybe this is mine." "Mine too," she whispered. He turned to her then, the light catching his face, softening the lines carved by years of solitude. "You're not thinking about leaving anymore?" She smiled faintly. "Not unless you tell me to." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then don't." The days that followed carried a quiet peace. They worked side by side, repairing the barn roof, tending to the calves, planting new seeds. There were moments of laughter, and moments of silence that said more than any words could. Sometimes, when the evening settled and the sky turned crimson, he would find himself standing beside her, watching the horizon. And without thinking, his hand would find hers. It became habit, unspoken, steady, like the rising sun. But even peace holds shadows. One afternoon, while mending the fence by the far pasture, a rider appeared, a stranger in a dark coat, his horse weary from the trail. Clara went still the moment she saw him. The man called out, "Miss Mayfield." Eli's head turned sharply. Clara's face paled. "Mr. Hanley," she breathed. The man dismounted, brushing snow and dust from his coat. "I've been looking for you. Your aunt's been worried sick. You just disappeared from the mill town 3 months ago." Clara swallowed hard, glancing at Eli. "I couldn't stay there. It wasn't a home." Hanley's eyes softened. "Maybe not. But they still care about you." He looked toward Eli. "I take it she's been staying here." Eli nodded once, his jaw set. Hanley sighed. "I don't mean to intrude, sir. But the girl's got people asking after her. She's free to choose where she belongs, but they'll need word, one way or another." He gave Clara a small nod, mounted again, and rode off the way he'd come, leaving behind a silence heavy enough to break something. Clara turned toward Eli, her eyes glistening. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to think I was running." He studied her quietly. "Were you?" "Maybe," she said, her voice trembling. "But not anymore." He nodded slowly. "Then write to them. Tell them you're safe. And tell them what else?" He hesitated. "Tell them you found a place to stay." Her eyes filled, but not with sadness. "A place, or someone." He looked away toward the horizon, then back at her. "Both." The next morning, she sat by the table, pen trembling in her hand as she wrote. Eli watched from the window, the faintest smile touching his face. When she sealed the letter and handed it to him, he took it wordlessly, promising to ride into town and post it. When he returned that evening, she met him at the door, her face glowing in the firelight. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About us." He removed his gloves slowly, watching her. "And what about us?" She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "That maybe we both stopped believing in love too soon." He felt the words like a tremor through his chest. "Love doesn't always survive storms." "Maybe not," she said softly. "But sometimes it's born in them." He looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice low and rough. "You're too young to carry my kind of past." "I'm old enough to want my own future," she replied. "And I want it with you." He reached up then, his hand trembling as it brushed her cheek. The warmth of her skin steadied him, and he realized that in all his years of silence, this quiet closeness was the only sound he'd ever needed. The night deepened around them. The wind outside was no longer cruel, it was soft, rustling the dry grass and the loose shingles. He wrapped his arms around her, drawing her against his chest, and this time when she whispered, "Can I slip dry grass and the loose shingles?" He wrapped his arms around her, drawing her against his chest, and this time when she whispered, "Can I slip under your coat?" It wasn't from cold or fear. It was from a quiet, sacred need to belong. He opened it, and she stepped inside, her face against his heart, her breath steady with his. And there, in that small cabin where grief had once lived alone, love returned, not loud, not sudden, but as steady as the fire that never went out again. Spring melted fully into summer. The land turned green again, and the wind that once howled with loneliness now carried the sound of life, the cattle lowing, the creek whispering, the soft laughter that drifted from the cabin porch. Eli had rebuilt the fence, the barn, and in many ways, himself. Every nail driven, every furrow tilled felt like a piece of his heart finding its way back into rhythm. Clara had brought small things into his world, a vase of wildflowers on the table, the smell of bread in the mornings, a hum that followed her everywhere she went. She wrote another letter to her aunt, this time not to explain her absence but to share her peace. "I found a home," she wrote simply. "And someone who understands silence as I do." Eli sometimes stood at the edge of the pasture, watching her hang laundry in the sun, the wind playing through her hair. He would think of how he'd once believed his life ended with the fire, that all warmth was meant to burn and vanish. But Clara had taught him that warmth could stay. That even ashes could bloom again if the right hands tended them. One evening, as the sky burned gold and the day faded, she came to him with that same look she'd worn on the night they met, half brave, half afraid. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked softly. "Every day," he said. "But it doesn't hurt the same anymore." She slipped her hand into his. "Maybe because they know you're not alone." He nodded, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. The ghosts that had once haunted the cabin now felt like quiet guardians. He could almost hear his son's laughter in the wind, his wife's voice in the rustle of the grass, but they were gentle now, not sorrowful. That night, the first summer storm rolled across the plains. They stood by the door, watching lightning dance over the horizon. The thunder rumbled like a memory, but Eli didn't flinch. He felt Clara's hand tighten in his, and for the first time since that fire long ago, he wasn't afraid of what storms could take. He'd already learned what they could give. When the rain finally eased, she turned to him, her eyes shining. "You saved me that night," she whispered. He shook his head. "No. You walked into my silence and filled it with life." Outside, the earth drank in the rain, and the scent of wet soil rose around them. He pulled her close, his coat falling around them both once more, the same way it had on that first desperate night. Only now, it wasn't a shelter from the cold. It was a promise, to protect, to cherish, to live. The storm passed, and the sky cleared. Dawn found them still standing there, wrapped in warmth and the quiet miracle of being alive. And for the first time in years, Eli Ward smiled, a real smile, wide and unguarded, as he whispered against her hair, "Welcome home."